Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. Thanks for rejoining us for this segment of the Sunday Wire. And as mentioned before the break, we've got a very special guest with us on the live link. Her name is Dr. Lissa Johnson. She's a clinical psychologist from Sydney, Australia, and she is advocating on behalf of Julian Assange. This is a very important issue that we mentioned before the break. It is the health of WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, who's currently in detention in Belmarsh prison in southeast London. And we've got her on the line right now to talk about this issue. Hello, Lissa.
Hi, Patrick. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, that's our pleasure. Is our pleasure, Lissa. We really appreciate you coming on to talk about this. It's a very important issue. I mean, I've alluded to this. Many have alluded to this and talked about it as a possible concern for the last 6 or 7 months, or longer than that. People have been concerned about this really since Julian Assange has entered the Ecuadorian embassy when he sought political asylum there 7 years before he was taken into custody by the British authorities. It's always been a concern, Lissa. But looking at this report, and I know that there'll be a report released, and news stories we'll start seeing them tomorrow, probably this week. There's a number of doctors, Lissa, that also share this concern. Not talking about one or two.
No,
we have 60 doctors and health professionals. Some of them extremely well qualified at the top of their profession.
Yeah, that's right.
What are they saying about this issue, Lissa?
Well, what they've done is on Friday, it's over 65 doctors, and as you say, some very eminent doctors in there, sent a letter to the UK Home Secretary calling for urgent action to protect Julian Assange's life. And, the letter's warning the UK government that there may be serious consequences if Julian Assange isn't moved from Belmarsh prison to an appropriate hospital setting where he can be treated by a specialist medical team. And the letter's saying that based on the currently publicly available evidence, there are very real concerns that Julian Assange may die in prison. There are a number of reasons for thinking that, which we could go into. The letter also details the chronology of Julian Assange's health difficulties and his medical neglect and the obstruction of him being able to sort of access his human right to health by the UK government. And along the way, there's been a number of warnings and there's been a number of junctures at which organisations like the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention and Human Rights Watch have called on the UK government to remove the threat of US extradition because Julian Assange has been placed in a position where he's needed to choose between either being extradited to the United States or his health suffering. And then that's really reached a crisis now in Belmarsh prison, which is what the letter is talking about. There's a number of reasons for these doctors to be saying that there are very real reasons to be concerned about Julian Assange's life. And the letter followed the case management hearing. I think it was on the 21st of October, when Julian Assange was looking very frail and fragile and struggled to answer basic questions about his name and his date of birth, which alarmed a lot of people present in the court. And then after that, on the 1st of November, Nils Melzer, the UN Rapporteur on Torture, issued a statement warning that if the UK government doesn't change course immediately and relieve the inhumane conditions under which Julian Assange is being held, that he may soon die as a result. And that's a very serious warning coming from the world's designated authority on torture. So the broader backdrop is that Julian Assange has been assessed by Nils Melzer and by a medical and psychiatric expert back in May as showing all symptoms typical for someone who's been exposed to prolonged psychological torture. And since then, he's been subjected to more psychological torture and, intensified, essentially, psychological torture, all of the conditions that were causing him to suffer from psychological torture have intensified. The arbitrary detention is still there. The UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention in 2019, when the 50-week sentence was imposed, said that this is a continuation of arbitrary deprivation of liberty. In everyday language, I guess that's false imprisonment. And since then he's been held in isolation, suffering the extreme stress of US extradition proceedings without being able to inspect the evidence against him, without having access to computer facilities and so on that he needs, access to his lawyers. So all of those things are rendering him extremely helpless under a situation of extreme threat. So the stress that he's under is intensified to the extent that shortly after the US announced its Espionage Act charges, he wasn't even able to appear via video link for a court hearing. He became so unwell. So the problem with the medical problem and the medical sort of crisis and emergency with somebody who has been suffering from psychological torture for a prolonged period is that psychological torture doesn't just affect people psychologically and cognitively. It also causes physical harm. And because what it does is it places people in a state of constant physiological arousal. It's a constant physiological stress response that's happening. And that, when it's persistently activated, the stress physiology is persistently activated, it can cause very serious health problems, which could include cancer or cardiovascular pathology, diseases related to immunosuppression. And there's no way to predict with any specificity when or exactly how that might strike a person. It could strike at any time. So it's essentially playing Russian roulette with Julian Assange's life to continue to hold him in Belmarsh prison, under these inhumane conditions that Nils Meltzer has described as very oppressive, and conditions of isolation and oppression and surveillance. Which are just, exacerbating the pressures that he's already under. So the letter is calling for him to be urgently and immediately transferred from Belmarsh Hospital on medical grounds, and also giving the UK government a heads up that, that it's their opportunity to back out of this really reckless and dangerous path that they're on with Julian Assange.
Yes, yeah. Well, the human rights argument is... It's so clear on its face, and the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Nils Meltzer, has outlined this very clearly, in depth, in detail. And I would think that for any other so-called dissident or any other political prisoner or any other high-profile person from any other country, especially countries that are seen as enemies of the US and the UK, any dissident, there would be outrage, and it would just be all over the press. There would be demands. Look at what the U.S. has done in the name of Sergei Magnitsky. They passed legislation in the name of Magnitsky. And this is happening to Julian Assange, and you hear absolutely nothing. It's as if international law and human rights, for some reason, doesn't apply in this case. Yeah,
it's extraordinary, and there's an extraordinary psychological blind spot that goes along with that. So there's the media blackout, essentially. It's not an entire blackout, but it's grossly underreported. The statements and reports that Nils Meltzer has issued, and the international law being ignored, it doesn't seem to be of concern to the media particularly. It's human nature that we see flaws in others and not in ourselves, and that happens on a collective level as well, that it's easier to see other nations persecuting their dissidents, arbitrarily detaining their publishers for journalism, which is what's happening here. But I think it's becoming so extreme that people can't stay silent anymore. I mean, that's what's happened for the doctors who've written this letter. They feel the need to step up. The UK government isn't, so they need to say, look, we can't be silent while a publisher is being arbitrarily detained and tortured on UK soil, possibly to death.
Yes.
And And more broadly, the precedent it sets, there are sort of two precedents being set. I think people have become more aware of the extradition precedent and that stands to criminalise journalism. But there's also a torture precedent being set where a publisher and journalist is being tortured with impunity in plain sight. And, democratic societies don't torture their publishers and journalists to death. So, if that happens, if Julian Assange does die in prison, that's really a shot straight at the heart of democracy. It's a nail in the coffin of democracy because, once we'll lose our chance to become a society that doesn't torture its journalists to death, and there's no coming back from that.
Yeah, I mean, the argument on international law that seems to be, the U.S. just generally ignores international law full stop, especially this administration, the Trump administration. It's they do undermine the UN at any turn, any potential turn. They'll use that opportunity to undermine the UN, international conventions. But Britain has seemed to be going shoulder to shoulder right behind the United States. In fact, if you look at what happened, what Ecuador allowed to happen, a total abrogation of treaties and conventions with regards to asylum or rescinding citizenship, and then allowing Britain to come in and basically do what is legally, by legal terminology, would be extraordinary rendition, to step on Ecuadorian soil, i.e. the embassy in London, to apprehend somebody, to render them back onto British soil. It's no different than going into another country and doing that. And so it seems like international law is completely out the window at every aspect of this case. Now, domestic law, it quite clearly is an unlawful detention for many reasons. We've outlined it. Nina Cross has outlined it. 21st Century Wire. He's being held as a Category A prisoner for a bail skipping charge. He's a first-time offender. He shouldn't even be in jail right now. And he's, again, not being allowed to prepare for his defense. So the British judicial system domestically has been commandeered by the United States in this case. And I was there at the hearing in June or in July, whereby the U.S. attorney was giving orders to the British judge.
It's extraordinary.
I mean, and Judge Arthnot, she didn't bat an eyelid. It was like, yes, sir. 3 bags full, sir.
Wow.
It's so the U.S. is commandeered. It seems to me they've commandeered the judiciary in Britain in order to do what they're doing right now to Julian Assange. So I don't know where justice is going to be had. Is there a chance that Australia, for instance, your home country, could mount some international campaign to have him return to Australia? Or because I don't see a lot of leeway with between the U.S. and the U.K. on this. But what do you think?
Well, I mean, it's certainly something that the Australian government could do if they chose to. So far, they have chosen not to, but they could certainly exercise diplomatic pressure and make efforts. There's a cross-party parliamentary group in Australia that's working to bring that about. There's 11 parliamentarians who've formed a working group, and they're attempting to lead the Australian government to do exactly that, to try and intervene on behalf of the legal and human rights of their citizen. So that's very hopeful that group has formed. And just this week, there's an event in the Queensland Parliament. They're hosting an event which is an information session to correct misinformation about Julian Assange. So that is hopeful as well. And there's some senior politicians in this parliamentary working group. But so far, the Australian government, I mean, Niels Melzer called the Australian government the glaring absentee in Julian Assange's case. And so far, that hasn't shifted. But it's an extraordinary thing for doctors normally don't wade into politics and public affairs. So it really speaks to the magnitude and the gravity of the ethical and human rights and medical travesty that we're facing, that doctors feel that they have to step in and try and urge the government to live up to its responsibilities, its legal and human rights responsibilities. That sort of speaks to how badly human rights conventions and international law and rule of law itself are being disregarded by governments and authorities.
And I want to ask you a question. As a professional, you're a professional clinical psychologist. I want to expand on a point you made earlier. You said that psychological torture, or how the person is being handled in what environment and how this is controlled, and psychological conditions can then manifest themselves into real physical ailments. And you talked about, autoimmune or adrenal depletion and all of these things that, under intense long-term stress, and how that a lot of people will think that life's just dandy in Belmarsh prison. And so Tommy Robinson was in there for, a month or something, and he came out, hopping and jumping around and stuff like that. And people just have this assumption that you're going to be well taken care of in there. But there is that chance that even if you have some access to doctors, that there are systemic health issues that are compiling, that are building up over time, that could end up sort of breaking you very quickly and very hard.
That's right. Yeah.
So explain that in his situation.
Yeah, it's very difficult for people to put themselves in the shoes of someone in a situation that's so alien that you've never experienced. I mean, most people haven't been in maximum security lockdown, but to understand what it must be like psychologically for Julian Assange. I mean, aside from I'll go into that in a second, the solitary confinement, but just the fact that you're rendered absolutely helpless while the world's most powerful nation, with all the money in the world, as many lawyers as it wants, 10 years to prepare, is getting ready to extradite you into what Nils Melzer has said will be a show trial, a trial in the Eastern District of Virginia where no national security defendant has ever won a case, facing 175 years in prison, where the UN Working Group on Average Detention and Nils Melzer have said Julian Assange faces the very real risk of even more cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment than he's experiencing now. So, and being prevented from preparing a defence, from reading the materials, in the case against you, from having regular access to your lawyers, from having access to the internet, he hasn't had that for a long time, computers. It's really, I've said before, it's like being held bound and gagged in the basement while your assailant is outside sharpening their knives. It's really a threat, an absolute threat to his life hanging over his head, and he's being rendered helpless. So helplessness in the face of threat is one of the most stressful and unbearable things for human beings, and that is there every day. And then so every minute of every day, actually. And then on top of that, another thing that is deeply damaging to human beings is isolation and solitary confinement, because we're social animals. We need interaction with other human beings, and we also need a certain level of stimulation, just, things to do, things to see, just input into our nervous systems in a good way. So, Julian Assange is being isolated for at least 21 hours a day, sort of effective solitary confinement. And for that time, he's been deprived of anything much to do other than think about, the threats that face him without being able to defend himself against them. So it's a horrendous situation to put someone in. So, chronically elevated stress hormones in those sorts of situations, they suppress immunity, which means you're susceptible to a whole lot of other diseases. It even causes immune cells to literally pop from chronically elevated stress hormones, and it puts the cardiovascular system under a lot of stress. All kinds of things get out of whack when your stress physiology is chronically elevated. Human beings are designed to be stressed in short bursts. We can cope with that, that's fine. But when it's relentless and it never stops, it's very physically bad for us. So it's sort of attacking the body's, being attacked from the inside out. And then as well as that, solitary confinement, people don't really understand how serious that is. I think people think it just means you're lonely, you're a bit bored. But that's not the case. Even after just 1 week of solitary confinement, brain activity can decrease, and that can be permanent even after just 1 week. After 2 weeks, concentration and memory impairments start to show up. and then that can influence people's ability to process information, to reason, to think. That can become very severely impaired. And that may well explain some of what we saw in the case management hearing where Julian Assange could barely answer questions about his name and his date of birth. I mean, it's hard to know exactly what's causing that, but it could be the effects of social isolation and understimulation. And he was isolated in the Ecuadorian embassy, and now he's been even more isolated for months in Belmarsh. So it's not a trivial thing. It's very serious, and it's not an exaggeration to say that solitary confinement really attacks the brain. So a certain level of social interaction and mental stimulation isn't just nice to have for human beings. It's necessary, minimum necessary conditions for mental functioning. And it can take people decades for their cognitive function to recover after prolonged solitary confinement. So obviously a question that raises is fitness to stand trial and fitness for Julian Assange to engage in his own defence, because, there's a very real possibility that this prolonged psychological torture and solitary confinement is effectively rendering him helpless to engage in his own defence. So that, as part of the call to transfer him from Belmarsh to an appropriate hospital setting, I mean, that's another thing that needs to happen. He needs to be assessed. There needs to be a neuropsychological assessment, a structured neuropsychological assessment of his cognitive function to determine, the impact of the solitary confinement and the consequences, for his ability to stand trial. And, someone who's experienced prolonged psychological torture against a backdrop of years of medical neglect and fragile health, that's a complex medical case. So, a hospital, even a hospital ward in a prison is not an appropriate environment for somebody with that level of health needs. What is needed is a hospital setting with multidisciplinary teams where consultation and liaison among specialists can take place, and second and third opinions can be sought. And that's what's needed to protect against basically malpractice and mismanagement and to ensure competent care. So that is what Julian Assange needs. And at an even more basic level, you don't treat a victim of psychological torture by continuing to psychologically torture them. That is no medical environment for a torture victim, which is kind of an obvious fact. Mm-hmm. But that's another point that comes out in the letter.
Yeah, the thing that really struck me as well is this: he has potentially a serious dental issue that where he should have had a root canal 7 years ago.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Anybody who's had an abscess or had anything, any sort of serious dental issue like that knows the physical and psychological pain involved there. And it's serious. And imagine not having any access or not having it treated. I mean, it's just
very hard to imagine. Yeah. And physical pain. I mean, that's the form of torture as well. Constant physical pain.
So he's a very sensitive situation right now. Mm-hmm. And as a medical professional, how would you rate this in terms of severity, like in terms of critical need to act immediately versus, well, it's potentially a problem, could be a problem in a month, could be a problem in 6 months, could be where do you rate right now today on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the most severe and 1 being not an emergency? Where would you rate this as a doctor?
It's up between 9 and 10 because of the unpredictability. It's urgent. I mean, that's the letter is saying this transfer needs to happen urgently. Because these catastrophic health impacts are unpredictable. Nobody can say when that might happen. So it could happen any time. So that needs to be taken very seriously. So it's urgent. It is urgent. And, the fact that Julian Assange looked so, he looked like he was prematurely aged and looked so frail, and his health has been deteriorating rapidly. And people who know him have been remarking on that. John Pilger, who's always been in the past fairly positive about Julian Assange's resilience, even he has been saying that, he's frightened that Julian Assange may die, that he's seeing a rapid deterioration. Julian Assange's lawyer, Jennifer Robinson, said that recently as well. Craig Murray, who said he'd been sceptical about reports that, Julian Assange was showing symptoms of psychological torture, says that now, and Craig Murray as an ambassador has seen victims of torture too, says no, he agrees Julian Assange is presenting just like someone who's been tortured, and that he's also now frightened and concerned that Julian Assange may die. So there are warnings coming from all over the place, and the situation's precarious. So that's why the letter is saying this is urgent.
Yes. Well, hopefully something's going to break on this issue. I mean, it can't continue. Of course, that would be a convenient outcome for both the U.S. and British governments if something that unfortunate was to happen while he was in custody. There would be a lot of people who would, let's say that would be their get out of jail card, no pun intended.
Yeah, well, that's the big worry, because then, a lot of people have woken up to the threat that US extradition poses, and that charging Julian Assange under the Espionage Act poses, that criminalises journalism and sets a precedent where a state can prosecute journalists, extraterritorially, which is a really shocking precedent. So people are more alert to that precedent. So you're right, it could be a way of achieving the same thing, of that chilling effect on journalism, of really going after public interest journalism, the kind of journalism that holds power to account, without having to set that legal precedent. But it's still a precedent will still have been set that a journalist has been arbitrarily detained and tortured to death. So,
yeah.
And I'm not a lawyer. I don't know what the accountability would be, but I think part of it's not explicit in the letter, but part of the purpose of the letter is trying to get the UK government to think about the fact that there is responsibility if Julian Assange dies in prison on the UK government's watch. They haven't done what needs to be done to protect his life and health.
Yeah. No effort whatsoever to uphold even the most basic international human rights standards in the face of multiple reports by different UN bodies.
And there's the human right to health and the human right to prepare his own defence. Even all of the issues around democracy and, the devastating precedent for democratic rights and freedoms, just in terms of human right to health and human right to prepare a defence. This needs to happen.
We want to thank you very much, Dr. Lissa Johnson, for your time and sharing this with us this evening on the Sunday Wire.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me on and for talking about it. It's a really important subject, so I appreciate it.
And we'll be seeing, I do predict we will be seeing Lissa and others advocating on this very issue in the coming weeks in the press, but possibly in the mainstream press as well. We'll see if there's how much interest there is. But good luck on also spreading the word with the other media outlets, and we're behind you and all the other doctors on this.
Thank you, Patrick. Well, 21st Century Wire is leading the way, like you always do. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Lissa. There she goes. Ladies and gentlemen, that's Dr. Lissa Johnson, clinical psychologist from Sydney. You can also catch her work, and we've linked it on the show page, her writings at New Matilda. She's written extensively on this story, but different aspects of Julian Assange's case. There's a link on the show page to the New Matilda. You can see Dr. Lissa Johnson's writings there. We're going to take a short break, and we're going to connect. We're going on the ground in South America after the break with our intrepid correspondent, Andre Vilcek. He's in Santiago, Chile, and there's a lot going on in Chile, in Bolivia, and also in Colombia. Andre's got the inside track on that. We'll be right back after this short break. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. This is the Sunday Wire. Stay right there.
Hi, I'm Patrick Henningsen, host of the Sunday Wire, and you are listening to the Alternate Current Radio Network.